In this lecture, we're going to be treating the religions of Taoism and Confucianism, which are Chinese religions. They represent the first historical religions that our course is going to survey after having introduced the Catholic theological principles for dialogue and for doing comparative religion, and as well dealing with the primal religions, and in particular Native Americans. On the two maps that I'm showing on these slides, you can see that these religions are pretty much confined to China as well as a few other East Asian countries, but they have affected billions of people worldwide throughout the centuries because of the population of those places. Now, we're only spending one lecture on these because really the religions of India and the Middle East, so Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, have more content in terms of what the Vatican has spoken on and what we see in traditionally religious characteristics that would be subject matter for this course. But I really think it is pausing for a day on these two Chinese religions just because of their influence and that they have similar characteristics to some of the other traditions that we're studying. Confucius lived between 551 and 479 BC. Confucius is not a great religious founder. He's not an otherworldly figure. He didn't perform miracles. He was just known as Kung the Master. He wanted to be a lover of the ancients. He was a very humble man, so he followed a kind of Socratic method and would ask people questions rather than going around preaching. He admits, I'm unable to be a good human. I can't serve my father. I can't serve my ruler. I can't serve my elder brother. I can't serve my friends. But at age 50, he does perceive what he calls a divine mission and spends the next 13 years wandering from state to state within China, preaching, seeing himself as a fellow traveler with those on the road to try to figure out what life is all about and to establish a society that has some peace to it finally, which we'll talk about here in a second. The problem Confucius faced was social anarchy. With the collapse of the Zhou dynasty and the period of the Warring States, which is from the 8th to 3rd centuries BC, we had mass slaughters of 80,000 people, 400,000 people, stories you can read about, people being boiled alive. And in this state of anarchy, the question that Confucius raises is, how do we keep from destroying ourselves? Imagine if America went into a state of anarchy and we lost all of our traditions. How would we know how to behave? What would we do in order to reteach people how to rear children, how to do basic things like cook properly and healthily? An example of this that came to mind several years ago whenever we were doing childbirthing classes was, should you need a class to learn how to give birth? Perhaps in traditional societies, this is all taught in the family, and indeed I've seen that. People don't need to go to classes because they grow up around it. It's a tradition. Everybody knows it. Tradition without law can be very powerful, to the point where in some countries, like Houston Smith mentions, in Greenland and in certain Native American traditions, they don't need laws because the tradition is so binding, so powerful. But in the absence of tradition and in the presence of anarchy, Confucius's goal is to reorder the whole social order and help others become fully human and to establish a peaceful society. Now, there are two counter movements that he has to argue against, and they're opposite extremes from one another. On the one hand, you have the realists. The realists want to solve the problem of anarchy by force, by constructing laws that have teeth in them, making people pay the penalty if they don't obey. On the opposite extreme, you had the mohists, where they had the Gog Sheng Ti, who guarantees that if you love, it will pay. Contrast this with books like Ecclesiastes in the Bible, that the same thing happens to people who are good and bad. They all go to Sheol. Being good doesn't pay off. Indeed, in this life, it doesn't pay off. So Confucius' critique of the mohists is that they're too utopian. You can't just simply love everybody equally. And indeed, he says, should we love our enemies? By no means. Answer hatred with justice and love with benevolence. Otherwise, you would waste your benevolence. This is different than Jesus. Jesus says that you should love your enemies. But Jesus doesn't mean that you have to be friends with your enemies either. Like Confucius, he's going to acknowledge that there's a difference between how you relate to your friends and your enemies. So a simple love and do exactly the same thing to all people is a little bit naive, Confucius says. But on the opposite side, the realists are too external. There's too much law. If you have laws that are overbearing, it causes contempt for the law. It doesn't change people interiorly, but only makes them want to rebel. Confucius's answer is to return to tradition and cultivate deliberate traditions, instill in the people a sense of order and a sense of community. To shift tradition from an unconscious to a conscious foundation, so that good actions become second nature. Note that he's not trying to make a religion. This is simply a matter of praxis. It's not a quest for the truth, but how to just get people into order. And I think that's important when it comes to the question we're going to discuss at the end of Confucianism is it ethics or religion? Here are the principal concepts within Confucianism. One is li. Li has the meaning of propriety. But within that, you can break it down into two meanings. One is, it means right, R-I-G-H-T, and the other one is right, R-I-T-E. The first one, it's the principle of harmony among gods, society, and humans. There's a bond that links all of us together. You might even call it the natural law, or in Hinduism they have this thing called the rita, this bond that makes us all part of one complex fabric of the world. And within that harmony, he has several different sub-concepts, like the doctrine of the mean, which is a balanced life. Virtue is the middle between two extremes, much like you see in Buddhism and in Greek philosophy. Also, constant relationships. He has 5 relationships called the constant relationships, which a person has to cultivate in the proper order in order to maintain this li, this harmony. And that is your parents, your spouse, your siblings, your friends, and your ruler. To each of those different people, you have different obligations. The second aspect to li is right, R-I-T-E. And this has our social lives choreographed into a series of sacred steps. It's like you're a vessel in the hands of God, and you have to find your sacred role and perform your actions properly. Similar, really, here to what you found in the dreaming and the primal religions, where you're trying to perform the proper ritual in order to enter into the mold of your archetype. Well, this is similar, but without the reference to the eternal or immortality anything. But it does have a recognition that there is something beyond ourselves that we have to conform with. I like to compare this to Christianity. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says that we are all temples. So we have a sacred function in society. And in Romans 12, Paul says that we are to offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. The next concept is gen, fellow feeling, sometimes it's translated, or human-heartedness. Basically, gen means the ideal relationship that ought to obtain between two people. If the two people are in right relationship, you and your ruler or you and your spouse, you have gen. The primary rule here to follow is the silver rule. Do not do unto others what you do not want them to do unto you. The cause of suffering is precisely the lack of fellow feeling or gen, when you do unto others what you don't want them to do unto you. The cause of suffering is something that every religion is going to identify. They're always going to have a problem they're trying to correct, and they're always going to have a way to overcome it. In the case of Buddha, the problem is suffering and attachment, and there's a certain path to overcome it. In Christianity, the problem is sin. Here, the problem is the lack of right relationship, and the silver rule is the means to overcome that. Your goal in life is to become a junzi or junzi, a gentleman. It depends on how you write it, whether you're transliterating it. I don't know Chinese, guys, so it depends on how you transliterate it. But I received, when I was taking world religions as an undergrad, this neat little plaque from my TA, and it was written in Chinese with this translation on the back about a junzi because I got the highest grade on the test or something like that. And it was about how you had to follow the mandate of heaven in order to become a gentleman. Well, the Junsa's goal is to be fit to lead, to organize society. And one of the neat quotes here is, this is in the optional reading, so you might not have done it, but it's on page 174 of Houston Smith. And the Junsa has a certain subsidiarity in his relationships. That is to say, he takes care of those closest to him first, and by doing that, he's able to radiate goodness out in outer concentric circles throughout the world. So here's what he says. If there is righteousness in the heart, there will be beauty in the character. If there is beauty in the character, there will be harmony in the home. If there is harmony in the home, there will be order in the nation. And if there is order in the nation, there will be peace in the world. So notice how you go from your own heart, which forms your character. If your character is in order, that brings about peace in your home. And the home then out to the city, the country, the nation, and ultimately to the world. This has a resonance in a couple of different statements from the Catholic Church. One is at Vatican II, where Gaudium et Spes says that the world's imbalances are rooted in the heart of man. Confucius, I think, would say amen to that if he knew the word amen. And John Paul II, who describes the family as the first and vital cell of society. If that cell is diseased, then we can't go out and make sense of the world around us and change it. So to wrap it up with Confucianism before we move on to Taoism, is it an ethics or is it a religion? I'll just give you a couple pieces of evidence to think about. On the one hand, Confucius says, you did not even understand life. How can you understand death? And he also says, you can't even serve your fellow man. How are you supposed to serve the ghosts? That would seem to militate against it being a religion. He focuses just on this life, as I've talked about in this brief lecture, and it seems not to be concerned about heaven. On the other hand, you have different quotes like, he who offends the gods has no one to pray to. And he who does not know the mandate of heaven cannot be a gentleman, like I referred to a second ago. He also says that heaven has appointed him to teach his doctrine. What does he mean by heaven? It's not exactly clear, at least to us in the modern West, but he does speak of heaven. And let me give you one more here that I like. This is on page 126 of Novak. He says, to serve those now dead as if they were living, and now departed as if they were still with us. This is the highest achievement of true filial piety. So clearly, at least Confucius, or someone writing in Confucius' name after him, thinks that you should still honor the dead and perform rituals. Do they actually think you go on to have an afterlife? Again, he's not really too much concerned with that. So perhaps Confucianism is a religion of society. It brings someone outside of themselves, but does it really have the characteristics that are needed to maintain a full-blown religion? I think that's where Chesterton's categories of God, gods, demons, philosophers comes in really handy, because this would be more of a philosophy according to Chesterton, and you might say it's a philosophy that has some of the gods mixed in with it. Confucianism has had a huge impact on China. I sometimes wonder if communism appealed to the Chinese because of their Confucian background and this idea of focus on this life and building society and community. That's just kind of amusing, I have. But up until fairly recently, the state religion of China, for 2,000 years, was Confucianism. And Confucian texts were the basic training for government officials. China has more than just Confucianism, though. As we're going to see in Taoism, it's like a yin-yang. They'll practice Confucian and they'll practice Taoist principles. I like how Smith puts it. The Chinese are Confucian in ethics and public life, Taoist in private life, Buddhist at the time of death, and with a dash of folk religion thrown therein. So that's enough for Confucianism. I'm going to spend more time on Taoism. Taoism is founded by a man named Lao Tzu, who lived in 604 BC thereabouts. And this is called by scholars such as Smith the axial age of humanity, because at this time religion had a huge leap in evolution throughout the world, from these mythic traditions to traditions that come on with great mysticism, enlightenment, and monotheism. For example, the 6th and 5th centuries BC is when Greek philosophy was spawning and flowering in Greece, when the Buddha lived, when Lao Tzu lived, roughly when Confucius lived, when the Hebrew prophets were operating and had monotheism and the afterlife revealed to them in Israel. Zoroaster, I believe, lived around here. So it's a very important stage in the history of the world. There's a myth about how Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching. He was upset because of his people's refusal to cultivate natural goodness, and so he is going to go right off into the sunset, and the people tell him, wait, share us some wisdom. So he writes this book called the Tao Te Ching and gives it to him, and then he rides off. Now, when you do historical critical examination of the Tao Te Ching, which is the principal work of Taoism, people tend to think it's a late 3rd century compilation and it came from multiple authors. Although it's assigned to Lao Tzu, it probably had development over time. You want to think of Taoism as a revolt against the Confucian concern for artificially creating a moral, ethical, political system. Taoism seeks out a larger reality, a more religious nature. It seeks out the Tao, sometimes pronounced like a ta, sometimes with a d. Again, I don't speak Chinese, but I believe the da is more correct. It seeks out the Tao, which is within every existence. They deified the Tao. The Tao means the way, and it existed as a word in pre-Taoist China. But now the way becomes divine and becomes something you're going to enter into and almost worship, as it were. Unlike the Confucians, who are forcefully inculcating traditions, Taoists believe that the ideal society is going to emerge by itself if you just harmonize yourself with the Tao. That's why I spoke of these religions as a kind of yin-yang. They're almost opposites, but they coexist in China. Smith discussed in your readings the 3 ways of Tao. Literally, it means way, path, method, or principle. And the first one is that... Well, I don't want to go out of order here. Just a second. Yeah, okay. Let me give a couple of points before I go into that. The symbol for the Tao here is interesting. I don't know Chinese again, but I like to look at the symbols and figure out what they mean and read up on them. It means go forward combined with head. So the implication of the Tao is you go forward with your head, with reason. So you apply your mind to harmonizing yourself with the Tao, and therefore, thereby helping the society emerge. Okay, first of all, the Tao is the way of ultimate reality. And a couple concepts within this. Smith emphasizes that the Tao is transcendent. It's beyond anything you can think or know. This harmonizes very well with what we saw in Native American and even other traditions we're going to see, where the God is so far beyond us we can't even speak. Thus, the Tao that can be spoken, Lao Tzu says, is not the true Tao. I love this one. Those who know don't say. Those who say don't know. In other words, we theologians really shouldn't be speaking, because if we think we say something about God, we really are wrong. And some Eastern religious people would take that to an extreme. As part of being transcendent, the Tao is described as empty. Why empty? It doesn't mean it's non-existent, but they use images in nature to convey why emptiness is useful. For example, what is it about a bicycle that makes its wheels work? Well, it's the spokes. The fact that there's empty space between them makes it work. What makes a cup useful? It's that it has empty space in it. And this is an image for how the Tao itself is devoid of form. You can't know anything about it. It doesn't appear anywhere. It doesn't have an application to our sensory experience, but you experience it by looking within. Then, moving on from the way of ultimate reality, the Tao is the way of the universe. The Tao is described as immanent as well. It's the all-pervasive driving force of nature, the rhythm, the ordering principle in our lives. It's the juice that flows through us, if you will, that makes us alive. It distinguishes a living thing from a non-living thing. This is going to be similar to what we find in Hinduism. It appears to some extent in Christianity. What's the soul? The soul is the life principle. And I think there's a helpful expression in Christianity that illustrates this principle of immanence. Although the Tao is beyond all things that can't be spoken, it's within the smallest particle. It's smaller than the smallest thing and bigger than the biggest. So Augustine says, God is more intimate to me than my very self. Deus intimior intimo meo. And Islam says that Allah is closer to us than our jugular vein. God dwells beyond and dwells within. On this topic of immanence, the Taoists also say that the Tao is like a womb or mother. We spring forth from the Tao and we return to the Tao. Much like for Native Americans, all things are Wakan, and we come forth from the Great Spirit and return to the Great Spirit. I would say then that similar to primal religions and the Native American religion, Taoist tends towards more of a pantheistic view as opposed to the Christian view. Then there's the way of human life when we are living in harmony with the universe. Happiness means to live in harmony with everything in the world. And the key virtue is to be good to him who has harmed you. Very similar to Christianity in loving your enemies. This is the best proof that you are aware that all phenomena are one. If you're aware that the Tao is equally in all things and that you have harmony with them, you won't return evil for evil. Evil is not to recognize the equality of all existences and to impose your view or power on others. Very pacifistic. And they're not going to stand up and have a lot of strong moral rules such as do not do this, do not do that, like we have in Christianity, because of this belief that if you let people go naturally, they will behave. There's a great romanticism in this that we would say is perhaps unrealistic. The next major concept is THE, which you could translate power or virtue. This refers to the Tao such as it's manifested in particular existences, particular things. So there's a certain THE that the Tao appears in me as a human versus how the Tao is manifest in a desk versus how it's manifest in a spirit. Three distinct schools of Taoism share the common objective of facilitating the power of the Tao, the THE, such as it flows through human beings. These are almost three different religions you're going to find. And in light of Chesterton's categories, you might well separate them off from each other, even though a person might combine any of the all three with them, any of the three together, along with Confucianism and Buddhism and folk religion. The original form of the Taoist tradition is called philosophical Taoism. This is essentially a worldview which lacks the features you find in organized religions. But there are a couple key concepts to it. The most important one is Wu Wei. Literally, it translates as inaction. You might call it active inaction, or some people translate it pure effectiveness. This is the reaction, again, to Confucius's inculcation of deliberate tradition. The key to government now is not imposing order, but to align yourself with the Tao, and once you're in tune, to let the Tao flow in and out of you in such a way that your actions occur spontaneously. If you force things unnaturally, then you deviate from the Tao. So you want to be inactive, to let God or the Tao just flow through you. My favorite quote to illustrate this principle, because I like to fish and cook fish, is governing a large country is like cooking a small fish. You spoil it with too much poking. And that is true. You have a picture here of a fish basket, which you can use to prevent a fish from falling apart when you cook it on the grill. You don't want to flip it over too much, or you'll spoil the fish. Some other great quotes. You want to improve the world? I don't think it can be done, so don't even try. In Novak, he has several examples that go along the same line. 164, I'll turn to, has a great one. When you realize that there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. Be content with what you have. Try to make people moral, you lay the groundwork for vice. The more prohibitions, the less virtuous people will be. Throw away holiness and wisdom, people will be 100 times happier. Throw away morality and justice, people will do the right thing. Could a Christian agree with this? To the extent that laws can be overbearing and cause revolution, yes, we could agree. But we would not just be complete libertarians about it and say that you don't need laws and rules. Law has a teaching function. So if people don't have a law, they might just think that everything's okay. There's some great commonalities with Christianity I find uniquely in the Tao Te Ching that I want to draw out for you. This one's on page 152 from Novak. Open yourself to the Tao, then trust your natural responses, and everything will fall into place. This is the principle of interior indifference in the spiritual life. Love and do what you will, St. Augustine says. Don't worry about the past, don't worry about the future. Just trust in God now and everything will fall into place according to God's will. You can't change what happened. You can't predict what's going to happen. You have to live in the present moment. This is related to the theme of interior detachment. The Tao Te Ching says, she has but doesn't possess, acts but doesn't expect. When her work is done, she forgets it. That is why it lasts forever. He who clings to his work will create nothing that endures. If we perform our action for the sake of God, in the case of the Taoist, for the sake of the Tao, and don't expect personal results, but we do it because it's the right thing to do, then it has enduring value. We have to be detached from the results and be content with it's the right thing. Let God make use of that work that we do for how He wants. Then there's the sacrament of the present moment, which I referred to in an earlier lecture. Quote, the master gives himself up to whatever the moment brings. He knows that he is going to die, and he has nothing left. He doesn't think about his actions. They flow from the core of his being. And then, finally, if you want to be given everything, give everything up. To me, that sounds like Matthew 16:25 when Jesus says, whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. In Vatican II, which says, the man finds himself only through a sincere gift of self. Lastly, in relation to Christianity, I think that the concept of wu wei and active inaction or letting God work can be compared to adoration of the Eucharist. What are you doing in adoration, an active or a passive work? Well, you're sitting there gazing at God in the Eucharist. You're passive. I like to put it how, in a sports term, you're like a catcher, sitting there waiting to receive from the pitcher. But even though you're passive, receiving God's grace, you also have to be attentive. So insofar as you're attentive, you're being active. To focus on what's coming at you. So it's both and. You're passive and active. I also heard someone refer to this as getting a Jesus tan in adoration. I thought that was kind of funny. You let yourself take in the grace of Christ and let Him transform you. You don't have to do anything except be attentive and receive it. The symbol of water is right at the heart of what the Tao means, and I want to give you several examples of this. Water epitomizes wu wei because it gives life and nourishes without even trying, so inaction. The Tao Te Ching says that a steady stream is powerful. It can turn sharp stones into pebbles without even trying. A whole gush might not do anything, but a steady small stream over a long period of time will carve out rocks. It works without working, acts without strain, persuades without argument, practices without preaching. And then for the person who wants to live in accordance with this, They need to learn how to have clarity and stillness, because water attains perfect clarity when it's still. We don't see the invisible until we are prolonged in prayer. The Tao appears when we can sit down and have peace and rest our hearts and minds. I think the Christian can say amen to that as well, because you can't find God if you're always a busybody and don't take time to contemplate. Lastly, with water, it adapts itself to its surroundings and always seeks out the lowest places. And indeed, water always flows downwards. And another similar one on that, the axe falls first on the tallest tree. This is why Taoists will honor hunchbacks and cripples, Smith says, because the one who's not tall, who's small in his own eyes, that person is praiseworthy. And I had to give you one more. It's called In Praise of the Weak. Supple and weak is the person who is alive. In death he becomes hard and stiff. The supple and weak tree takes the higher position. You're willing to be bent one way or another. Not to break, but you go with the flow. And don't get all angry if things don't go exactly your way. I think this is what Jesus is getting at in teaching about how we need to take the lowest place at the table, as you find it in Luke 14:10. Next, let's talk about the yin-yang. Everybody has seen this. They probably had it on their book bag or something as a kid. Yin-yang illustrates the harmony of the universe and the relativity of all values. Opposites are identical for a Taoist. It's an illusion to say they're distinct. There's a tension that's complementary between the yin and the yang. The yin represents the female and things associated with females. This might sound a little bit chauvinist, but that's the way that they put it. That which is slow, passive, diffuse, cool, wet, night, winter. That's the black. The yang, the white, is the male, fast, aggressive, focused, hot, dry, day, summer. And notice how there's a little bit of black in the white, a little bit of white in the black. We'll talk about that in just a second. And to begin to illustrate that, I'm going to read you page 215 in the book of Houston Smith, the story of the farmer and his horse, which gives us a great literary exposition. So there's a farmer one day who says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And this was true for the next day. Let me start at the beginning of it, sorry. The next day, he has a horse run away, and he thinks it's all bad. But then it comes again with a drove of wild horses. So he thought it was terrible because his horse ran away. But then it's great because it comes back with the drove of wild horses. Okay. Then his neighbor appears, this time with congratulations for the windfall. He receives the same response. Who knows what's good or bad? Again, this proved true. For the next day, the farmer's son tried to mount one of the wild horses and fell, breaking his leg. So it's bad that those wild horses came now. More commiserations from the neighbor, which elicited the question, who knows what's good or bad? And for a fourth time, the farmer's point prevailed. For the following day, soldiers came by commandeering for the army, and the son was exempted because of his injury. So what appears as bad may become good, and what's good may appear and eventually become bad. Very interesting. And in Christianity, we say something similar, that God can bring good out of evil. But does the Christian simply accept what the Taoist is insinuating here? I don't think so. We don't believe that good has to be tainted with evil. We don't believe that the yang has to have yin in it. In heaven, there is no evil. So that's different than the Taoist view. We do believe that there can be a silver lining in the clouds, so maybe we accept that the black part, the yin, always has a little bit of yang in it. In fact, we would say, even with the devil, he's not purely evil. He's good insofar as he has existence, and evil is simply the lack of a good that ought to be there. But rather than saying that good and evil are relative in Christianity, we say that God can bring good out of evil, but we still call black black and white white. Notice how the yin-yang is in a kind of curve, showing how it's in constant motion and it goes around and around for all space and time. What's good and bad change. So again, Christianity has something similar with God bringing good out of evil, but we would argue that that is the fullness of truth, and that we have something that we share with the Taoists, but more precise in light of divine revelation. Next we come to vitalizing Taoism, hygiene and yoga. Like philosophical Taoism, this is a self-help path. It's different though because it focuses on conserving the Tao. The former seeks to conserve the Tao, whereas here you're trying to increase its supply. I like how Smith described this as trying to increase income versus reducing costs. And we do this through qi or breath. Qi is the vital energy or power of the Tao, which flows through all things, and especially in man. You've heard of Tai Chi probably. Well, that's a series of movements that are designed in order to facilitate the flow of the Tao. It gathers calisthenics, meditation, philosophy, and martial arts all together into one. And some of you may have done Tai Chi before even. And then vitalizing Taoism also has a sort of meditation that assists your mind. Akin to Raja Yoga, which we're going to find in Hinduism. In this meditation, you draw in the qi and you accumulate the energy and then transmit that outward to the community. In Buddhism, there's a type of meditation called Tonglen, which tries to do the same thing. You sit there with a blank mind, passive, waiting for the reception of the Tao, so you can understand what you're called to do, and then transmit that Tao, the Qi, that is the Tao flowing through all things, to others. Lastly, we have religious Taoism, or popular Taoism. This arose in the 2nd century AD, so about 7 centuries after the original form. It is decidedly non-philosophical. It's concerned with preserving your qi eternally, a focus which you didn't find in the other two kinds of Taoism. Your goal is to achieve immortality by tapping higher powers, not just through calisthenics, as in vitalizing Taoism. What's fascinating here to me is, originally, religious Taoism has a pantheon of 3 deities, and one of them is an incarnation of the Tao in Lao Tzu himself. Ironic that the founder gets divinized here several centuries after him. And this is like the Buddha you're going to find. In original Theravada Buddhism, Buddha is just a saint. He's one who points out the path. But then in later Mahayana Buddhism, he's deified. People will argue sometimes that Jesus got deified too. Well, that's a great argument to have. But if they did deify him, they did him pretty quick. Because by the time Paul's writing in the 50s AD, people are already saying that Jesus rose from the dead and that he's the Lord and Savior. And the Gospels have Jesus saying those things. I like what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if Christ hasn't been raised from the dead, your faith is in vain. You're still in your sins. And in the context of that, he goes through the resurrection appearances and says, at one time Christ appeared to 500 people at once, most of whom are still alive. The implication being, if you don't believe, go ask these witnesses. We could give you the names of the apostles and others who saw him alive. And we have documents, actual manuscripts that are from the first couple centuries AD, written very close to the time of Christ. So we know this didn't take hundreds of years to happen. Christ, if he was made up as God, had that happen to him really fast. And of course, as Christians, we don't believe that. But it would be extraordinary for such a thing to have occurred in Christianity, whereas in these cases it's not surprising because you have several hundred years intervening between the original figure and his divinization. So in conclusion, this yin-yang of Chinese religion, you could parallel them here and say Confucianism is classical, it's rational. Taoism is romantic and intuitive. It's more of the feminine. Confucianism, active social responsibility. Taoism, creative, letting it be, let things emerge on their own. Confucianism focuses on the human, seems not to even be a religion. Taoism tends to focus on the transcendent. And I'll leave you with this quote from the Tao Te Ching, which is extremely beautiful and really has a lot of resonances with Christianity and how we view God as being so far beyond all created things. That's what we mean by the word ineffable. There is a loving, wonderful, and perfect. It existed before heaven and earth. How quiet it is. How spiritual it is. It stands alone and does not change. All life comes from it. It wraps everything with its love as with a garment, and yet it claims no honor, does not demand to be Lord. I do not know its name, so I call it the Tao, the way, and I rejoice in its power.